Hey YouTube, you're about to watch an exchange I had with Ash's mentorship group. So I started the call with a little bit of theory around conditioning and understanding the intensity spectrum, intensity domains, thresholds, and those concepts. And then we went into Q&A with the second part of the hour. So here you go, you get a little bit of theory and a little bit of Q&A for the call. Enjoy the video.
So I'll probably skip a bunch of slides, but you'll get the gist of it. Are you guys all familiar with the size principle, or called Henneman size principle? So I like to start there, and I'll stay pretty surface level, but I think it's an important principle to understand. And one of the reasons why it's so interesting to me, it's because it applies nicely to both strength training and to conditioning as well. So anytime we can find a principle that works across that spectrum, I find it pretty interesting to use it so that we have a reference point regardless of where we stand, so to speak. And so what the Henneman size principle says is that essentially your body is going to recruit motor units and so muscle fibers according to the task at hand. So the higher the force you need to produce, the more muscle fibers you're going to need, and then the more motor units you're going to recruit. And as a quick reminder, a motor unit is the neuron, the axon, and the muscle fibers that it's attached to. So essentially, when you have a small amount of force to produce, you're going to recruit primarily small motor units, which are usually attached to smaller muscle fibers, typically type 1 or slow oxidative fibers. And as you move up the chain and you have to produce more force, you're going to be recruiting more type 2A, and then on very explosive movements or very high intensity movements, you might be going into those type 2X fibers. And again, this principle applies to strength training, but it also applies to conditioning. So that's why I wanted to start with this slide specifically. And one thing to understand that's important is the amount of muscle mass that is recruited, which is illustrated by this dotted line. Essentially, as you recruit more motor units, you're still using the ones that you previously recruited or the smaller ones. So essentially, it goes up exponentially, the amount of muscle mass you're going to be using. And so the cost of the effort that you're putting out is also going to go up in a non-linear way. And that's something that we'll come back on. The whole fatigue aspect is very important. Just because I like this slide, I'll put it up. You guys all know what this is? It is the electron transport system, and it exists inside the mitochondria and inside the mitochondrial inner membrane. And essentially, this is where everything finishes, so to speak, from an energetic standpoint. So I'm not going to go through all the bioenergetics and energy systems right now, but essentially, no matter what happens from an energetic standpoint, you're going to need to recycle stuff through this electron transport system. And this is the only place in the body where you can actually use oxygen. So you can see this little oxygen molecule at the bottom here with the two little red spheres that are attached together. This is O2, and this is where it's used at complex 4. And the interesting thing to remember is just that everything ends up with that electron transport system, whether you're talking about phosphocreatine, glycolysis, using fats, it doesn't really matter. Everything has to be recycled at some point through this system. And so the oxygen that you can bring in and sustainably bring in to maintain the steady state internally, so to speak, to fuel all the reactions is going to be very important. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So that was for the more surface level, a little bit deeper stuff that I wanted to start with and kind of set the stage for the second part, which I think is probably the most important aspect of conditioning. So if you understand this, you've understood 60% of conditioning, and then it's just a matter of details. So again, size principle, we looked at this together. We're all clear on this, or do you guys have questions before we move forward? We're all good?
All good.
If you do have a question, please just unmute yourself and just ask the question. Just cut me in my words. So we're going to look at something called intensity domains. And to understand this concept, we're going to talk about water in its different forms. So what forms do we find water in on planet Earth? If we keep it fairly simple, you guys answer.
Ice.
Ice. Okay. Solid form. What comes after if we get a little bit warmer, above 0 degrees Celsius?
Liquid.
Okay. It's not too complicated. You guys should all get that part. Okay. So you catch my drift. You see where I'm going. Now we pass the boiling point, 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, let's call it. Now we get gas. Okay. So we have 3 different states, so to speak, of water that we can find. And yes, the purists will tell me that there's many different other states that we can talk about. Let's keep it simple for today. So we have 3 different states, and the freezing point, 0 degrees Celsius, what is it, 32 Fahrenheit, and then 100 degrees Celsius are the transition points between those states. And it's good to understand that those transition points 0 and 100 are not perfect. They're not fixed, right? If we change the pressure, so if we go to altitude, for example, the boiling point is, I think it's 68 degrees Celsius at the top of Mount Everest. So it shifts depending on multiple factors. And why I put this forward, it's because we have a similar reaction inside the body on the intensity spectrum. So those are called intensity domains. And if you read exercise physiology research, you'll find things like the moderate exercise intensity domain, heavy domain, severe domain, and extreme domain. And the severe and extreme are pretty close one to the other. I'll quickly explain what the difference is between those two. But I think the 2 big distinctions to understand is that transition between moderate and heavy. So let's call it the freezing point, and the transition between heavy and severe. So the boiling point of water. And if you look at it on the scale, it's kind of disproportionate towards the extreme domain. So if you look at peak power output for someone on a bike, for example, and then you look at where those other transition points will be, you can see that the extreme domain is really, really big, but we're going to focus really on those intensity domains and those transition points at the bottom. So when we say moderate intensity domain, so we think freezing, what we have to understand here is that the work is sustainable at the muscle level itself, at the cellular level. So say you're cycling, your quads are doing the work, and they can do so sustainably. And you would see that by, for example, seeing very low levels of lactate in the blood. And the reason for that is that if you're recycling more lactate than you're producing, which is the case at low intensity, then you wouldn't see any increase of lactate in the blood. Now, we passed that S1, which should be T1 in English, threshold 1, or the first threshold. And thresholds can be measured at different points in the body. You can measure them via gas exchange. You can measure them through lactate. You can measure them through other devices, but they all represent the same thing. It's a change in internal state. So again, moderate is a steady state at the muscle level. And then we go heavy, which is a steady state at the whole body level, because now the legs themselves can't, let's say, maintain that steady state. There's a little bit more lactate that is produced than you can recycle. So what you see is, okay, that gets pushed into the blood. Now we have slightly elevated but stable levels of lactate in the blood. And then we go to the second threshold, so that transition heavy to severe. And now what happens is that the work is no longer sustainable. We can no longer maintain it. We can no longer stabilize our internal state is what's going on. So we lose that balance internally, and we quickly go towards failure of the task. And those are really important distinctions to understand. So like I said, you got a cellular or even a muscular equilibrium or balance in the moderate domain. You're going to have a systemic equilibrium in the heavy domain, and you're going to have a loss of systemic or a loss of metabolic steady state above that second threshold. Are you guys still with me at this point? This is, if we have to spend a few more minutes on this, it's fine. This is very, very important. Again, if you guys understand this intensity spectrum and distribution, you've understood 60% of conditioning, period. I was talking about lactate. So if we look at a lactate curve on the intensity spectrum, like I said, we're going to see minimal and stable levels, usually between 0.4 and 1.5 millimoles per liter. And that's low intensity in the moderate domain. We're going to see elevated but stable levels of lactate between the two thresholds. And that can vary greatly from one person to the next. To keep things simple, if you have somebody that has little muscle mass, very ultra endurant type of profile, you're likely going to see fairly low levels of lactate. If you take somebody that's very muscular, very powerful, you'll likely see higher levels of lactate at a given intensity on that spectrum. And then if we go into severe, we have a fast accumulation of lactate, and you can measure values anywhere from 6 to 18 millimoles, sometimes more. And in the extreme domain, you have a very fast accumulation. You're usually going to find the same max values there. If we look at the VO2 kinetics, so how oxygen consumption evolves in those different domains, essentially the important thing to understand to begin with is that VO2, so the utilization of oxygen, goes up linearly with intensity. So that blue line describes how much oxygen you utilize as you go farther into the intensity spectrum. And if we think about utilization on one side and delivery on the other, so bringing oxygen to the muscles for them to use it, the delivery is going to respond in a similar fashion to utilization up until the second threshold. And you can see here that there's a plateau in terms of the distribution or the delivery of utilization of oxygen above that second threshold. Does that make sense to everybody? So the harder you go, the more oxygen you consume, period. And then your delivery systems are going to match this up until that second threshold. And then you can no longer bring enough oxygen for what is being used. So you're going to trend towards what we call VO2 max or VO2 peak, because delivery has plateaued and we cannot go any farther. And you have that delta in between. For those who are familiar with critical power concepts, this is what we would call W prime. We'll keep that for maybe another time. If we look at a very endurant profile, what we'll see is this, meaning that you'll be able to hold a very high percentage of your VO2 max at that second transition, that second threshold, and that W prime, that kind of reserve that you have at high intensity, is going to be much smaller. So again, the distinction between a more endurant profile that we see here and a more powerful profile that we saw just before. In terms of how VO2 evolves, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but for those interested, you have a fairly quick, steady state of VO2 when you exercise in the moderate intensity domain. If you go in the heavy intensity domain, it goes a little higher, but then instead of plateauing, there's kind of a little rebound. That's what we call the slow component of VO2. And essentially, it's that slow component that kind of goes out of control in the severe domain. And this is why we eventually reach what we call VO2 peak or VO2 max, because we can no longer stabilize what's going on from that side of things. And then the distinction between severe and extreme domain is nothing more than the one where essentially extreme domain is anything under 2 minutes. Any effort that you sustain at a very high intensity for about 2 minutes. Why? Simply because if you measure VO2 and you go really hard for a minute and a half, as hard as you can hold it for a minute and a half, you're likely not going to express your VO2 peak, so the maximal oxygen consumption that you could display in the severe domain. And this is how researchers make the distinction between those two domains. So essentially, it's really short and hard efforts, which are going to induce local fatigue, so the legs in cycling, for example, before you're even able to express that VO2 max or VO2 peak. Now, if we look at causes of fatigue, there's similar ones across the intensity spectrum, but most likely in the moderate domain, it's a glycogen depletion situation. In the heavy domain, that's the one that's the least understood, but we have depleting glycogen stores and we have accumulation of metabolites. And both those things are going to essentially make contraction and relaxation of muscle fibers pretty hard. And then in the severe domain, it's fairly different. We have a significant drop in pH, so the acidity inside the muscle itself gets high, and we don't have enough phosphocreatine anymore to maintain those contractions. So why the intensity domains? Why are those things important? Because they allow us to manage our intensity. They allow us to individualize training between different individuals. It allows us to track progress over time and to orient the planning of training depending on everybody's needs. And so again, if you understand that spectrum of intensity in those different domains, you have the blueprint of what everybody's distribution is going to look like. And then depending on the person, you know, okay, what type of training do I need for that person for that purpose? And if we look at different profiles, so we have somebody who's sedentary. If we look at those are watts on the x-axis. So assume we're on a bike. A sedentary person will have a profile like this one. Somebody who's trained would have something like this, and an elite cyclist would look something like this. So let's take something simple here. Let's take 200 watts. If you take 200 watts and you draw a vertical line, you can see that it's the same power for everybody, but it's not at all the same stimulus for each person. For the sedentary person, it's in the extreme domain, so it's going to be something that's going to be really hard to maintain for even 2 minutes. For somebody who's trained, it's going to be in the heavy domain, so it's something they're going to be able to hold for an extended period of time. There's going to be fatigue that accumulates, but slowly. And for the elite cyclist, 200 watts is not even what they do on a active recovery day. So it's a literal walk in the park for them. And so this is one of the reasons why understanding this distribution is very important. And we also want to make every training session that we go through the most practical or the most applicable possible. We want to get the most out of every minute of training. And by understanding this distribution and using it, we will be able to optimize all this. This is a graph that I think is probably the most important one after understanding this distribution. So first, before I go into this, are we all clear up to here on what those domains mean and what they're trying to show us inside the body? Do you guys have any questions on this so far? We're all good? Okay. So again, this I think is one of the most important graphs that I have. And essentially it just shows the intensity spectrum as you've seen it so far, and the cost on the y-axis, the cost of training at those different intensities. And what's interesting is that it's not a linear trend, and it changes depending on where we are. And I'll explain to you what all this means now. So at moderate intensity, when you're clearly below the first threshold, the cost of exercising there is extremely low. Because we have a steady state at the muscle level itself, there is no stress or very little stress that's imparted on the rest of the body. Very little neuromuscular activity, because we don't have to recruit big motor units with big muscle fibers. We can sustain that work very easily. And we're actually going to have a parasympathetic dominant state at those intensities. So from a nervous standpoint, it's quite interesting, especially to counterbalance all the high intensity stuff that we usually have to do for our sports. And so the cost of working there is very, very low, which is one of the reasons why you can do so much and it won't impact your training negatively. And it also is also going to give you the base and the capacity to assimilate the other harder types of training. Now you can see that there's a fairly important transition between the moderate and the heavy domain in terms of fatigue. So we have a steep increase at that first threshold. And it's a pretty fuzzy area. Remember the transitions between the different states of water. We don't want to assign a precise wattage or an exact heart rate to those transitions. We just want to know that those are happening. If we think in terms of RPE, because if you don't have any measurement tools to determine lactate or stuff like that, I like to just use the RPE scale of 10. In the moderate domain, I would say anything between 1 and 3. Once you're getting to 4 or 5, you start to feel a little tingle in the legs. You finish your session, you have a little bit of fatigue, really not a lot. It wasn't hard, but you feel it a little bit. 4 or 5, you're usually on that transition somewhere, on that first threshold. So when I prescribe low intensity, it's usually going to be 2 to 3 out of 10, not more than that. If you feel your legs at the end of the session, you either went too long or you went a little bit too hard. So you want it to feel really easy. Then, so that 4 or 5, you keep it for the transition. And I'm not saying you should never train there. Okay. You should train there sometimes and for a good reason, but you shouldn't spend your life there. You should spend your life mostly underneath. So it doesn't cost you anything. You can train more, you can build capacity, and then we go and use the harder stuff to kind of drop the hammer. So heavy domain, you can see that there's an increase in fatigue there and cost of effort. But it's still not very high. We have another little step up at that second threshold. Again, an important transition. They've measured that fatigue accumulates, I think it's 4 or 5 times faster at about 110% above So 10% above that second threshold versus 10% below. So there's really a difference in how fatigue accumulates and what the cost of effort is going to be there. And then you can see that it's just going to go up exponentially once you pass that second threshold. So understanding what the cost of effort is going to be will help you determine how much of each training you should apply for people that you work with or for yourself. If we think about adaptations, those are, I think, just useful to illustrate what's going on, not necessarily to follow down to the T. Obviously, at low intensity, we're going to have mitochondrial density and volume that's going to develop vascularization and capillarization of the muscle fibers that are used. So think of the capillaries as the parking space, the parking spots at the airport for the taxis. So when the cab goes to the airport to drop someone off, they have to park, and then people come out. Usually there's 4 passengers. Takes them a minute to get out. So if there's 4 parking spots, 4 times 4, you can offload 16 people per minute. Now, if we were to double the number of parking spots, well, you can offload twice as many people per unit of time. Okay. It's the same thing with oxygen. The more capillaries you have, the more oxygen you can pass from your blood into the muscle per unit of time. And little side reference, that second threshold, which is also called critical power, depending on who you talk to, is highly correlated to the number of capillary contacts around your type 1 fibers. Okay, so essentially, the more oxygen you can bring to your muscles and maintain that internal steady state, the higher that second threshold is going to be. So capillaries and mitochondria is the name of the game when it comes to sustaining a high rate of work and also to recover faster from hard work. So we have all this going on. Obviously, cardiac output is going to be improved at those low and medium intensities. We want to let the left ventricle fill up completely and then eject all the blood, which is essentially stretching the left ventricle, making it bigger. We're going to have better metabolic efficiency, so better recycling of lactate and better utilization of fats as a substrate. And on the topic of substrates, because I didn't go through those slides with you guys, it's important to understand that how much fat you can use as a fuel is predicated on how much mitochondria you have. The more mitochondria you have, the more you can use fat at a given intensity. And the reason for that, I've outlined it in one of my YouTube videos if you want to go check that out later for a bit of additional references. But essentially, the mitochondria, imagine it's a building, okay? And if you have a tiny little house, you're only going to be able to do what? Put 1 door on each wall. So you have 4 doors total on that house. So the amount of people that can come in and out of this house at any given time is pretty small. Now, if you have a massive building, think of an industrial building, a big depot, you're going to be able to put maybe dozens, hundreds of doors. And that means that per unit of time, again, you can get more people in and out of that building. It's the same with ATP and ADP. So the bigger the wall, the more doors you have, and the more ADP you can bring in, the more ATP you can spit out. And that means if you have a lot of doors and you can keep that ATP high inside the cell, then you're not going to use glycolysis, so the breakdown of sugars, as much, which means your body has room to use fats. This is essentially how it functions. So again, go watch that additional video. Ash, I'll send it to you after if you want to put it as another reference. So Ash, how much time do we have in total? Just so I leave some time for questions.
An hour.
An hour. Okay. So I'll do another 5-10 minutes and then we can go on questions. Finding threshold 1 and 2, there's different ways of doing it. The suboptimal ways of doing it, in my opinion, are using heart rate max and percentages of heart rate max. And I'll explain why. The whole MAP and mass, so maximum aerobic speed, maximum aerobic power, and percentages of that value, I think is not a great way to do it. Ideally, if you want to measure physiology, so like I said, lactate, VO2, other measurements, you can also use critical power, critical speed for the second threshold. And this is accessible through performance metrics. So you do a couple hard efforts and you can calculate your critical power and critical speed. You can also use RPE. My favorite way of doing it is a combination of physiological measurements and RPE. But in the event that you don't have any physiological measurements to calibrate all this, I would just use RPE. And if you tell me, well, my people don't know how to listen to themselves, then that's your job to teach them how to feel that they're human and exercise in line with that. I think RPE is highly underrated. In my opinion, there's nothing more objective than the subjective. So you have to learn how to listen to yourself, and this is going to make you a better athlete and just a better person in general. So learning how to calibrate your efforts to a scale of 1 to 10 is extremely useful in my opinion. The reasons I don't like heart rate max as a starting point, it's because this is the spread of the good old 220 minus age. So it's not even a thing. Just forget it altogether. It's literally not a thing because it's 220 minus your age plus minus 15. Plus minus 15. So you could be right on the money. You could be 15 high. You could be 15 low. It's not a thing. Don't use it, please. And then we often use, based on that, or your watches will usually do that. They'll give you a percentage to calibrate your zones, right? So if we think of that zone 2 to 3 transition, which is that first threshold that we saw previously, moderate to heavy domain, it's usually going to give you what, 70% of heart rate max. This is your top of zone 2, right? Well, it works for some people, as you can see here. Those are measurements that I made on people. So some people, you're right on the money, 70% of heart rate max at your first threshold transition, moderate to heavy. For some people, it's going to be way below. And for some people, it's going to be way over. So again, those fixed percentages might work for some people, but also might be completely off for others. So if you don't have those physiological measurements, just use RPE. Don't use percentages of heart rates. The zones that I just mentioned, they just essentially trickle down from the intensity domains. That's in an ideal world because we've measured the physiology, so we know where those transitions are between the domains, and now we can extrapolate those zones. So the domains are descriptive. They describe what happens inside the body. The zones are prescriptive. They help us plan training and organize it so that with our tiny little human brains, we can wrap our heads around what is going on and maybe also make things a little bit more digestible for the athlete because now they know what they're going to be working on. Like I said, you're going to have significant differences in heart rate between modalities. So you cannot transfer something that you have on the run to the bike and vice versa because you have a different position in space. You have a different amount of muscle mass that's recruited, different types of contractions even between the run and the bike. If you think about the impacts with the run, if you think about the continuous motion on the bike, so those things will have an influence. And so that was my section on the intensity distribution and understanding the underpinnings of conditioning. And I think it's best that we keep the rest of the time, Ash, to exchange. And now I can answer questions that are going to be more practical and geared towards maybe more of the application, the training, and those other ideas, if that works for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you, Sean. Has anyone got any questions? I've got a few if anyone doesn't have any, but I think there's a few things I want to pick up on for sure.
I'm all ears.
Patrick, are you preparing to ask? Is that you?
I was going to let you ask a question first.
You go first, mate. This is more for you than it's for me, so no way.
Just in terms of, I've written down a while ago, you said about when training, obviously it's type of muscle contraction, how quickly you can relax will help, obviously with certain movements. Obviously in CrossFit, that's kind of one of the main aims that we're aiming for. Mm-hmm. How would you go about, obviously it'll be very different per person and per movement, but how would you go about training that and trying to help develop or trying to increase or decrease, the time for the contraction to the muscle relaxing? Obviously it can vary massively.
I think, well, what's interesting is that, at least to my knowledge, all the energy systems are really there to relax the contraction. The contraction happens once your brain decides that it's going to happen, and you have the signal goes down the axon, and then you have the calcium release, and then you have the contraction happening. And it's actually on the uncoupling that you need the ATP to uncouple that contraction. And I believe that your conditioning status is going to be a big determining factor in how fast you can do this, because it's just a matter of ATP turnover. And essentially the more capacity you have, the better it is. So without even going too much in the details, because I don't necessarily think that this is going to be a differentiating factor or a limiting factor, regardless of the sport. Maybe in sprinting, it's the most important because of the speed of the contractions themselves. But I personally wouldn't focus on the relaxation part of the muscle. I probably would rather focus on a slightly more macro scale, which is how fast can you recover from a given contraction? So how long does it take your body to rebalance everything after you've done something hard? Because, and to your point, when we talk about CrossFit, this is the name of the game, right? Whoever, if we say equal strength, equal skill, equal gymnastics, equal speed, the person that will hold the highest rate of work for the longest period of time wins. This is pretty much what it is, if you put everything else aside. And so it's just a question of how high can you get that second threshold, if we think about the intensity distribution that we talked about, so that the high intensity work costs you less. And when you do recover, you recover faster from it. Remember, threshold 2, we talked about oxygen getting from the blood into the muscle fibers to maintain that high turnover of ATP and rebalance everything out. So I think this is probably where the most interesting stuff happens, is in the recovery process, and essentially the infrastructure that will help you support all the high intensity stuff you're doing. Obviously, you need to be strong, you need to be powerful, you need to be able to move big weights, and you need to do it efficiently from a movement standpoint. But you need all the bottom infrastructure, the type 1 fibers that will recycle the lactate, recycle the hydrogen ions, recycle all the stuff that your bigger muscle fibers are producing, that they just have to produce it, right? But if you have more infrastructure to recycle it, you'll recover faster, and you'll be able to go sooner, and you'll be able to maintain that for longer. So I know I didn't answer your question directly, but I would put my focus on that.
No, it does answer it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, can I just build on that, Sean? Because I think that's a beautiful point, in that I'd never heard it articulated like that. And essentially, the better conditioned athlete is better able to relax muscles after effort. And the way they get better conditioned is by doing more of the work that builds that infrastructure. But the way I would think about being good at relaxing is being efficient in the movement, which comes through doing a lot of work and building neuromuscular efficiency and the skill side of things. Mm-hmm. So the solution is the same, whether you explain it through energy supply or through neuromuscular efficiency. They've just got to do more reps of the movement to become more skilled.
100%. And I do think that how many reps you do of something really, really matters, because that's going to drive down the cost of the work too. You see that in running, for example. If you look at Paula Radcliffe, who was one of the best marathon runners in history, her VO2 max actually trended down across her professional career. But her running economy, so how much it cost her to run at a given speed, kept going down and down, kept going up, meaning that for a given speed, it would cost her less and less oxygen, less and less energy to produce that effort. And I think it's very much that game in CrossFit, where you can, how much does a thruster cost you? How much does a wall ball cost you? And if you want that to cost you less, to Ash's point, you need to move as best as you can, the most efficiently possible. And then you need to get the reps in, so that your body learns to do it at a lower and lower cost. And then you essentially win on both ends. You win by having more capacity to do work, but also for the work to cost you less than the person next to you, because you've done more of it.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. You got anything else, guys? Any other questions?
Yeah, I guess so. I'd always been told about zone 2 being heart rate based. I know now it's not. I've listened to the podcast too, so all over it. But I still can't help but look at my heart rate when I'm doing it.
Yeah.
And then wonder sometimes if it's too low, is that just because I'm such an amazing athlete, or is it I need to work harder? Because I always sort of thought, okay, it needs to be 110, 120 to be still somewhat challenging, but not, building too much lactic acid. But if I look at it, it's like, oh, it's 100, it's 90. Is that just because I'm slacking a bit, or that is still beneficial?
Oh, I don't think there's any slacking.
Okay.
I think we're so and I don't know your specific situation, obviously, but as a species, we're so sedentary that just moving a little bit more is just going to be good for you. And for some people, that might be get 10,000 steps and make sure you get them every day if you don't already, and that's an hour and a half of just walking. So do you do that? Or are we just sitting at a desk all day and then sitting in our cars and then just exercising 1 hour at the gym and doing nothing else? So it's, sedentary athlete, as I call them. So for me, zone 2 is yes, it's a training thing, but more and more in my mind, it's also just becoming a lifestyle thing where we just want to not be sedentary and we want to be active people for no better reason that we've evolved to be that way. And in order to be healthy, we need to be that way. And this is very much exemplified by the current predicament and illnesses that you see around the world, especially in developed countries, especially in sedentary people. We need to move more. So yes, heart rate is, or yes, zone 2 is important in training. But I would even say, just don't be sedentary is more important to start. But then to your point, I don't think there's a heart rate that's too low. One thing that you can do as a little test is how long are your zone 2 sessions right now?
20 to 45 minutes, depending on the time I've got.
Okay, so find 45 minutes and put a heart rate monitor on and do a 45-minute session at a steady intensity. Try to aim for a 3 out of 10 in terms of effort perception, and then look at your heart rate trend between minute 10 and minute 45. If you were to do an hour, you would look at it between minute 10 and minute 60. You shouldn't see it moving up. It should stay flat. Okay. If it creeps up over time, you're either going too fast or you've extended beyond what you can tolerate in terms of duration. Some people are almost allergic to anything over 30 minutes. And so you put them on a bike for 40 minutes and they're fatiguing simply because it's 40 minutes. It's not because it's hard. So you have to consider the duration part as well. But as a general rule, if your heart rate stays stable between minute 10 and minute 60 on a really easy effort, you're good. You're good. Okay. And then, the next session, you can challenge yourself and go 10 watts higher, 15 watts higher on the bike, see what happens to your heart rate, and do that over a few sessions, play around up and down, and then find that fine balance where it stays a 3 out of 10, no fatigue in the legs, and your heart rate stayed nice and flat. That's going to be a good rough indicator that you're at the right intensity.
And I appreciate that being on the bike is going to have more carryover to then using a bike in a competition, say. But I know I can't run at a heart rate that's anywhere that's like it's at my max, no matter what. So is walking still sufficient, or is that not as good again a carryover in terms of competitions? Like for my clients, fine. It's probably like you said, it's still good for people that are sedentary, need to move more. But me walking up a hill, is that going to help me be a better athlete or is still being on a bike better?
I haven't run the trials on that yet.
No.
I would love to, get competitors walking a couple hours every day and seeing what the carryover to their recovery is. And my suspicion is that it's going to be considerable. So I do think that walking, even for active people or trained people, is still an important part of the whole low intensity, be active recovery and capacity and all that stuff. For the running side, obviously you're supporting your body weight in space, you're vertical, you have more muscle mass, so your heart rate's going to go higher off the bat. That's definitely a thing compared to the bike. What I would recommend you do if you do want to run is just alternate between run and walk. So you run slowly for a minute, you walk for a minute. You run slowly for a minute, you walk for a minute. And you do that for 20 or maybe 30 minutes the first time. And again, you look at your heart rate. Did it stay nice and flat across those running stages, or did it creep up? Right? If it creeps up, just keep the same session until it flattens out. And then you can extend it and do 2 minutes of running, 1 minute of walking, 2 minutes of running, 1 minute of walking. Same thing. Does it creep up or not? And that's going to give you a very easy way to progress your running, and also a good way to accommodate to the stresses and the loads of running. Because most people that don't run a lot tend to get hurt really easily when transitioning to running because they do too much too soon. So I would have this very progressive approach with a run walk progression, and I would also include some foot, ankle, and lower leg strengthening. because that is a big missing piece in the whole running side of things. So bike, because it's quote unquote free in terms of effort and load on the body. Running, definitely important, especially for people that need to run in their competition. But it needs to be, I would say it needs to be implemented with more respect. Then the bike, you can kind of go to town and you're going to be fine. But the running, you just have to respect it a bit more and be more progressive.
Fine. Thank you.
Sean, are you a fan of the cross trainer as a in between?
I don't know if fan is the term I would use. I don't have anything against it. Honestly, at this point, man, anything that gets people to move fairly easily for extended periods of time, I'm game. I'm even working with a couple powerlifters, and they're starting to explore, weighted walking. So just weight vest or heavy pack and just go walk for 2 or 3 hours. And that's, we're really close to the hiking scene at that point with those ideas. But I really think that it can be a very good stimulus for heavier athletes that can't run, for example, or maybe shouldn't run. Because if you're, 120 and built like a mountain, you maybe running is not going to be your jam. So a bike is cool. But depending on your occupation, maybe, walking with a pack or with a weight vest might be a good intervention. I've seen some special forces guy, obviously they need to walk a lot. So that would be a very specific intervention, but I've seen some good results with overall endurance built through walking like this. So to come back to the cross trainer, I'm all for it as long as people move.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. It's the standing cycle. That's the way I think of it.
It's a good way to see it. I like it.
Anything else, guys? Lewis, you're quiet. Anything from the shadows?
No, sorry, I was just eating because I just finished work. But you go ahead. You got any more, Ash?
Yeah, I've got one. I've got a few actually. The first one, Sean, was you touched on that there is a business case for training at the transition between the domains.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, I think obviously, the case I made was really to put forward that there is no wrong intensity to train at. There's just intensities that you should do in certain proportions, more or less, depending on what you're trying to do. To go back to your question, the way I see it currently as a broad prescription, I would say that if you're doing low intensity consistently, so maybe twice a week minimum for 30 to 60 minutes, I would say that every 5th session of low intensity, you want to include something on that transition. It doesn't have to be the whole session, but out of 60 minutes, you might start with 10, 15 minutes there. So you do your warm up 15 minutes, you go there for 15, you come back out for 30, nice and easy. And then, 6 sessions later, when you do it again, maybe you go there for 20, 25 minutes, and you just kind of build on that so that you do spend a bit more time in there, but it's a small proportion of your low intensity training, but you're still touching on it. You don't want to never be there. So that's how I would include it as a broad recommendation right now.
And why would you do that rather than going all the way into the heavy domain for the same approach? You
could, but spending time at different intensities on the spectrum is going to be important to be comfortable everywhere, and also to get things moving to the right. One of the big objectives of training conditioning is to move all those thresholds to the right. You want to move your maximal power up. You want to move your first threshold up. You want to move your second threshold up. And this is how you get to look like the elite cyclist profile that I showed on the intensity scale. And to move things to the right, you need to work underneath them most of the time, especially for the first and the second threshold. Yes, when you're a beginner, you can get away with doing pretty much anything and things will move up. But when you get to a certain level, you have to spend time underneath to push them up. So I do the majority of the volume well below and then a little bit right on the transition. And I'd probably argue the same approach or a similar approach for moving threshold 2. And obviously, if we think about what people call training in that domain, it would be tempo training or threshold training. This is kind of the 2 zones, 3 and 4, that you have kind of there in between. And obviously tempo, it's kind of the same, right? Because threshold, you're just underneath, and tempo, you're a little bit more underneath, but you're still just underneath. So what does it mean? It just means tempo, you're going to be able to accumulate a lot more volume there than if you do threshold type stuff. And obviously, depending on the situation, you might want to do one or the other, or you want to progress from one to the other. So you start with tempo, build up into threshold. So we kind of push things from the bottom. And maybe you can, have the same case for the first threshold, where you first build capacity below, and then you come and challenge it a little bit. But again, challenging, it's not, for most people, it's not challenging work, because it's going to be 4 or 5 out of 10. Once you're at a high level, that transition is more and more costly, because the absolute value is much, much higher, right? Pro cyclist, 320, 330 watts at their first threshold. So even 30 watts below their first threshold, they are 300 watts. So it might be moderate for them. It's still 300 watts. So you have to fuel them, right? So even just from a fueling perspective, it's a freaking nightmare. So they'll usually train at 250, 270, and they'll get a lot of volume there, because it's less costly. They can do more, again, less fatigue. So they could train at 300, they could train at 310, but it starts getting really costly for them. So that's another distinction. The higher the level, the higher the endurance level of the athlete, the farther away from that threshold you're going to train. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. It's like super strong guys also have to go, like, spend more time at lower percentages. Like if you've got, a 300 kilo deadlift, you training at 90% is not the same as somebody with a.
That's exactly the same. It's exactly the same. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's really cool to think about. Thank you. And I guess I like the idea of pushing from beneath, in terms of pushing everything to the right. If you're working with somebody where zone 6 and zone 7 is what it's all about, is the approach the same, or would you want to be doing more max effort stuff because that is the sport?
Both.
And
it's obviously going to depend on what part of the season are we in.
Okay.
And you're going to have the general phase and the specific phase. And in the general phase, you're going to work stuff that's going to be away from or different than what you're going to need in competition. And then when you get to the specific season, now you're going to go closer to your event. To take 2 very simple examples, if you take somebody who rows 2,000 meters, so for the best guys, it's under 6 minutes. So let's take a 6-minute effort. It's definitely in the severe domain, right? In the red. And just to give you an idea, the second threshold is usually going to be between 30 and 60 minutes that you can hold at that pace. It really depends on the level of the athlete, because obviously a highly trained cyclist can hold that kind of razor's edge for much longer than somebody who's untrained, because it's still very hard, right? So the 6 minutes is in the red, in the severe domain. Now take a half marathon. That's going to be kind of just above that first threshold, right? A little bit higher for the top guys, but in that ballpark, an hour and a half. And so the 2 very different events. And for the rower, VO2 max or zone 5 work is specific to his competition. So that's probably what you'll end with in terms of his preparation. So you'll probably start out at the extremes. When I say extremes, it's kind of tempo threshold on the low end, because the low intensity, the zone 2 stuff and zone 1, zone 2, for me is a non-negotiable all year round. It doesn't mean you do the same amount all year round, but it's kind of always going to be there in some fashion. Sometimes more, sometimes less. It depends on the needs and the time of year, but that's always going to be in the background somehow. So the high intensity is anything between zone 3 and zone 7, right? Anything between threshold 1 and max power is going to be intense, so to speak. And it's obviously not the same intensity. So that's why on a tempo session, the top guys can do 2 hours of work at tempo, and at max power, you can do 6 seconds. And then that's it. That's all you can do. So going back to the rower, you start at the ends of the intensity spectrum. So you would start with the tempo, and you would start with the maximal sprint, and you would converge down into the event. Whereas for the semi-marathoner, early stage of the season, general prep, maybe his VO2 max needs to go up a bit. For him, that's general, right? For the rower, that was specific. For him, that's general. So it's a general quality, and then we build upon that general quality. So that's how I would kind of orient the thinking around what intensities when. It's obviously going to depend on the sport. It's going to depend on what time of the year it is. And it's also going to depend on who we have in front of us. Because maybe you have someone who's away from the elite level that has a profile that's completely opposite to what they need for their event. So maybe you need to do something different than what you would do in a normal preparation with a general and a specific in a competition phase for that person, simply because they have different needs. So who's the person in front of you? What's the time of the year, and what's the event? I would ask those questions.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, I love that framework for breaking it down. I think it's a fairly common situation you see with CrossFitters where somebody's come from an aerobic background and they just don't have the top gears. So they can go all day, but their limiter is the short, fast workouts where they need to absolutely send it. And I think that's a challenge for people to program for, because it almost feels wrong to be getting these people just doing tons and tons of shorter, harder stuff. Do you have any sort of suggested sessions for that avatar of person where you're trying to teach them to just be able to empty the tank? Because, you know, there's some people where they literally, you know, I know people who run the same speed for a 200-meter run as they would for an 800-meter run. They literally can't go any faster.
Yeah.
And how would you approach that problem?
I would approach it very carefully. I've seen you can do some real damage with some really high intensity stuff, some, you know, Wingate sprints and those type of very, very high intensity efforts. And for a very endurant type profile that you're describing, you can destroy them, as in they're really going to get beat down by the training and not get anything out of it, or not much out of it. I've seen that happen. So to prequel this, I would say that taking someone from a very endurant profile into being able to express, you know, gear 4, 5, 6, and 7, or 5, 6, and 7 is much, much harder and limited in terms of development potential compared to taking someone who's already has the muscle mass, the infrastructure, the power generation capability, and then building the base underneath that. I think that's a lot easier than the other way around. So somebody who already has the muscle mass and the power is at an advantage when it comes to long-term development, in my opinion, because for the endurance profile to put on that amount of muscle mass and be able to use it from just a nervous standpoint, I don't even know if they're going to be able to, you know, bridge that gap if we're talking about CrossFit and the current needs of the sport. So I would, again, going back to your question, I would go there progressively. So what I have done in the past is first make sure that, because you can have an endurance profile and be crap at endurance, right? That's totally possible. Just because you have that profile doesn't mean you're good at it. You're just made for it, but maybe you haven't developed it. So what I have done is build the base first. So think zone 2, 3, 4. Because that's the bottom of the pyramid and that's the infrastructure, right? You build that for that person first. Then you go and you sprinkle in some high intensity zone 5 stuff. So it's intense, but it's also not 6 and 7, right? It's still manageable. And you see how they respond and you see how they react. And maybe they do really well. And maybe you can push them 6 and 7 right away. But from my experience, I would prescribe those in low volumes. And I would really monitor how the person reacts to them, because they might go through them perfectly and they might really get beat down by them. And in that case, you have to pull back and you have to, you know, go at it again progressively. So yeah, build the foundation, zone 2, 3, 4, sprinkle in some 5, come back to 3 and 4, sprinkle in some 6, come back to 3 and 4, sprinkle in some 7. And then over time, over long periods of time, months and years, you can develop those capacities. But I think it's a lot harder in that direction, getting somebody very endurant to tolerate those really high intensity efforts. It's a lot easier the other way around. Take somebody really powerful already and just get them to walk slowly. That works. It's a lot easier to implement than getting somebody who's endurant to be powerful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. Totally aligns with my experience as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Has anybody else got another one?
Yeah, we can do another round of questions, guys. I've got a few minutes.
You going in, Patrick? No. I was going to ask. You kind of touched on it already with Alicia's question. Is zone 1 useful? Was the question. Like, you basically covered that off, right? And that it is still useful. I guess the angle I was coming at it from was, as compared to zone 2, does something actually change physiologically that makes zone 2 more useful than zone 1? Or is it kind of an arbitrary line because they're both in the moderate domain?
They're definitely an arbitrary line from a zone standpoint, right? Because there's no physiological distinction between zone 1 and zone 2. They're both in the moderate domain, and we remember that the physiological reactions change between domains, not between zones. So technically there's nothing that separates. It's more of a spectrum than a straight line between 1 and 2, but obviously the intensity changes, right? Doing an hour on the bike at 120 watts or 140 watts for a guy and having 110 120 heart rate is going to be different than walking for 4 hours at 100 heart rate. But on one end you got more intensity, on the other end you got more volume. And I got to thinking about this a lot last weekend. We were in the mountains with my wife, and we did a bunch of hiking, and I could see the case, and I haven't fleshed out this thought fully yet. So I'm really just talking from what I thought about this weekend here. But I think there could be a case for the beginning of a season, starting with a camp, 2 weeks in the mountains, and you just hike your face off, and you just walk and you just spend time being active. And obviously you maintain your strength and you maintain your speed and all those things. But coming out of 2 weeks of hiking, obviously you do it intelligently and you progress the volume, blah, blah, blah. But I could see that as being a really good starting point for work capacity for a future training block after that. So it's you obviously have to really move the dial up on the duration because the intensity is much lower. But that's also an advantage because now you're doing so much more work. It's just a question of do you have the time or not? That's always the big, and that's even the conversation between, I don't have time to do low intensity training because it takes up so much time, right? So for some people that's the barrier. It's I don't even have 2 extra hours a week to do that easy stuff. So go tell them to find 10 hours to go hiking, so that obviously becomes logistically complicated, but in an ideal world, something that I'd like to explore at some point with my athletes, I think there could be a very, very strong case for walking over anything more intense. Again, not the whole year, not all the time, not for everybody, but in that very specific situation, I think it could be very interesting.
Yeah, I love it. That's I think Lewis's secret: long hikes and long rides, eh?
Yeah, does he do that?
Yeah.
Do that, Lewis?
Yeah, just naturally. But then I'm similar in a way that I struggle to put out top end power really. But as a kid, I would just run. If I was bored, I'd just run or upset or whatever. Being like hormonal, I'll just always run. So then coming into CrossFit, I'm decent in the open because of the 20-minute AMRAP. As soon as it gets to quarterfinals where it's high power, I don't do as well.
Yeah, and so again, for me, my first inclination when I start working with someone or when I advise someone on how to proceed forward, it's always going to be try to complete your profile. Let's think about it from a GPP perspective. Let's think about it from who are you as an athlete, as a person, and let's try to bridge the gap. So it's usually going to be things that you don't like because you're not so good at them, because you never do them, because you're not made for them, which makes total sense, right? But you just have to go against the grain, so to speak, and just start working on those weaknesses, really. And they're not weaknesses from the perspective of the sport itself. They're just where you can improve the most because that's just not what you're made for. And usually the best stimulus is the one you've never had. So doing something that you're not used to is often going to have a good stimulus in the beginning stages, simply because you haven't done it before. So it's a good thing to exploit and try to build upon afterwards. But it obviously takes a lot of discipline because you have to do things that you don't necessarily enjoy doing to begin with.
We'll get that 200 time down, Lewis. Don't worry. Any other questions, guys, or have you got to go, Sean? I know we're a bit over time now.
I've got 5 more. If you guys have another question, happy to answer.
Anyone else got anything? No, that's everything on my list. So yeah, thank you very much, Sean. I'll get that link off you for the mitochondria video later. But
Yeah,
really
the fat oxidation one. I'll send it to you right away. I won't forget.
Awesome. But yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
your insight and expertise.
Thank you, guys. That was fun.
Thank
I hope I was able to bring some valuable information. I've recorded that and I'll put it up on my YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again to take some notes or review, you're obviously welcome to do so.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great evening. I'll speak to you soon.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys. Thanks a lot.